Hello and thank you so much for joining us. Whether you're watching on TV or online, I'm Anthony Robart. We are waiting for the latest update from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. That is in about 15 minutes or so. He will give his national address from his home at Rideau Cottage in Ottawa. He will then take questions from reporters. We will be there every step of the way. Of course, we'll bring that to you live the moment it begins. And we also continue, of course, to monitor the latest numbers of COVID-19 infections in Canada and around the world. Let's begin with the big picture. And globally, there are now more than 2.2 million confirmed cases of coronavirus, with almost 680,000 of those in the United States. In Canada, now more than 30,000 people have tested positive. Now let's take a closer look at the number of cases across our country. Quebec still has the most infections with close to 16,000 cases. That is 1,000 more than yesterday. Ontario, meanwhile, has surpassed 9,500 cases, with 55 new cases reported just moments ago, in fact. Across the country, more than 1,200 people have lost their lives. Now, one of those deaths in the country's prison system. The Correctional Service of Canada says an inmate from Mission Institution in British Columbia died from an apparent complication related to the coronavirus. This is the first known COVID-19 related death in a federal prison. 54 inmates and 8 correctional officers at the medium security institution have tested positive. Across Canada, about 150 inmates have tested positive at federal prisons. Now, this news comes amid growing calls to reduce prison populations amid the pandemic. In fact, more than 50 federal prisons across the country are now affected by an outbreak in one form or another. Let's bring in Abigail Beeman, who joins us from the nation's capital. Abigail, thank you so much for joining us as always. What do we expect to hear from the Prime Minister today?
Good morning. Well, we expect to hear economic help for a variety of sectors. Now, the big question is, for weeks, we've been asking, will there be help for the oil and gas industry? Of course, hard hit by what's been going on. And I am told by a government source that there will be help announced for the oil and gas industry today, but that really this is help across a wide variety of sectors. So we'll wait to see exactly what that means. A source in the Alberta government office is speculating that the feds don't want to make it look like a big oil bailout, so that any liquidity announcement would be for several sectors at once. But it will wait and see exactly what today has in store.
Yeah, we've been waiting for weeks, and certainly the oil and gas industry have been waiting for weeks, and they were in many ways promised by the finance minister that things would be coming soon. We may hear some more details on that. Last night as well, the Prime Minister had a very important phone call, teleconference, I guess you could say, with the country's premiers. What was discussed in that, and what came out of it?
Well, a lot. This was I'm told, a 90-minute, an hour and a half long phone conversation. That's not unusual. These have been happening on an about weekly basis, and they go for about an hour and a half or 2 hours. It was an audio phone call, or an audio call, not video, last night. I'm told that the Prime Minister led off by speaking about the dire situation in long-term care facilities, and that's something where really everybody across the country seems to be on the same page in terms of getting resources to long-term care homes to help with what's going on. How that actually rolls out and what will happen is another matter. But lots on the table discussed last night. Something that a lot of people have their eye on is help for commercial rent for small businesses. The federal government is committed to doing something on that. So a lot of people anxious for more details. That's something that was discussed among the premiers, the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister last night. The Ottawa side describes the conversation as productive, good, a fruitful discussion. Everybody's really still on this Team Canada effort. A source in the Ontario government says that there is some disconnect or unhappiness from provinces that have been looking to hear more information before the feds make big announcements that affect the provinces or are linked to the provinces. They're not so thrilled with how that communication has been going, or they're looking for better communication going forward. An example of that would be the commercial rent program that they're looking for more information on, because that does have provincial jurisdiction as well. But big picture here, a productive hour and a half long conversation between the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and the Premiers last night.
And there's an interesting political balance. I mean, you mentioned when it comes to the rent help, but also when it comes to the issue of long-term care homes, that is a provincial jurisdiction. We'll explore that a little bit further on. But we're also hearing the Parliament will be resuming in one form or another, and pretty interesting developments on that. Could you outline how that will look?
Sure. So as of right now, if all four parties don't reach some kind of agreement otherwise, all 338 MPs are scheduled to come back to Ottawa Monday morning, April 20th, for what would be a quote-unquote normal sitting. But nobody wants 338 MPs within close proximity of each other. They've already met twice in a reduced format. There is a push to move to some kind of a virtual parliament, but the Conservatives are not happy with that plan if it's not augmented by in-person sittings. We heard the leader of the Conservatives, Andrew Scheer, this morning speaking a little bit more about that. So if no deal is reached to figure out some kind of virtual parliament, and you can bet that all parties have been negotiating and trying to come to some sort of deal, but here we are on Friday, then Parliament will resume as normal by Monday. But again, you can bet that it will go down to the line to figure out some sort of plan, because again, nobody wants 338 MPs and the staff involved and everything else resuming to sit in Parliament together. Now, important to note that Andrew Scheer has said that if he wants these in-person accountability sessions, but it's okay from his point of view for it to be that small group of about 30 MPs. He's not calling for 338 people in a room together, but everybody has to come to some sort of agreement in order for everybody not to show up in Ottawa come Monday morning.
Yeah, that could be a massive logistics issue, not to mention a health issue, but interesting and intriguing as well to have that balance between the accountability, especially in a minority parliament, that a lot of people expect and certainly the opposition leader would desire. Abigail, we will leave it there for now. Thank you so much as always. And we stay in Ontario for this very important story because a powerful moment in the province earlier this hour. Thousands of healthcare workers stood silently to honor one of their own, a Brampton hospital cleaner who died of COVID-19 last week, in fact. Colleagues described the 58-year-old as a dedicated employee. Peel's medical officer of health says he likely contracted the virus in the community, not at work. Now, currently, healthcare staff make up about 11% of all reported COVID-19 cases in the province. A startling number there. And some developments overseas because China's official death toll from the coronavirus has jumped sharply. Why? Well, in Wuhan, at least twice as many people died from COVID-19 than was previously counted. State media has attributed the undercount to overwhelmed health systems. The addition of almost 1,300 victims raised Wuhan's death toll to more than 3,800. Let's head south of the border to Washington now, where Global's Jackson Prosco is standing by. Jackson, thank you so much as always for joining us. So while the death toll in the United States continues to rise, there's obviously a lot of pressure, in many ways put by the president, put on the states to reopen the economy. Some talk about that, and some are talking already about reopening very, very soon. How is that looking?
Yeah, good morning to you, Anthony. Yesterday, the White House actually released guidelines for a phased reopening of the country, but it's worth pointing out that these are guidelines only. They're optional, and it really is up to the individual states to decide how they want to proceed and move forward here. It's a phased approach that the White House is recommending, and what they're saying is that every 14 days, the states should take stock of their situation. And if they see a decline in case numbers, in deaths, and in hospitalizations, and if they see hospital capacity freeing up, then they can move from one phase to the next phase. And to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, the current recommendation is no gatherings of more than 10 people, for example, and that non-essential businesses should essentially be shut down. That's the current phase. The next phase that people could potentially move to would allow gatherings of up to 50 people and restaurants to reopen in a very limited capacity with some small amounts of seating inside. And then 14 days after that, if states see positive trends, they can move to another phase where they open up even more to eventually get to a return to the society we used to know. It's worth pointing out, though, that a number of health experts are questioning whether this is at all realistic, given the shortage of tests testing in this country. Many states are nowhere near close to being able to move to even phase 1 at this point because they're still stuck in a massive healthcare crisis. New York and New Jersey are prime examples of that right now. And so this really seems like it's a long way off, but there are a small number of states with low numbers of cases, small populations that could potentially start to move to this sooner than later if they feel that their situation is good enough.
Yeah, but the pressure is building, certainly. And when you look at the numbers, the job numbers, the job loss numbers more specifically, outline that and how that has played out over the last few weeks. It is devastating, to say the least.
These are remarkable numbers. Another 5 million Americans filed jobless claims just in the last week. That's 22 million Americans who have lost their jobs in the last 4 weeks. And those staggering numbers, which are the worst since the Great Depression, may not capture the full picture because there are people who essentially work in the gig economy who are not captured by that. There are state unemployment offices and city unemployment offices that are overwhelmed. They can't process all the calls and their websites are crashing. And so people who are still trying to file unemployment claims haven't been able to do so yet. These are staggering numbers. They give you a sense that any economic recovery is not going to be instantaneous. It's not going to be like flicking on a switch. And Anthony, when you talk about reopening the country, there is still an assumption there that people want to go back to their jobs or want to go back to eating in restaurants. It's not clear that's going to be the case. And if people don't feel comfortable resuming their daily activities, or if it's slow and gradual, the economic pain is going to be dragged out over a very long period of time.
Jackson, I mean, the numbers there, 22 million plus you see on the board there. It's astounding, no matter what measure. Jackson Prosco joining us from Washington. We always appreciate that. Thank you so much. And if you're just joining us at home, we are waiting for the Prime Minister's national address, his daily address, really. That will happen in about 4 minutes, give or take. We'll bring that to you live the moment it begins. Let's stay in Ottawa and bring in our chief political correspondent, David Akin. And David, so many issues, of course, to discuss. We talked about the oil and gas lobby and the request for help. Also interesting as well, requesting a pause on environmental regulations. Outline that for us.
That's right. So this is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, or CAP. It's the country's biggest oil lobby group. They sent a letter to the Natural Resources Minister, Seamus O'Regan, on March 27th, asking for a pause on about 30 different regulatory requirements that the oil producers have to fulfill. Anything from pollution monitoring to water quality, things along those lines, but also asking Transport Canada to back off a push that the federal government has had to rapidly refit or replace many oil tank cars. It's an issue of rail safety for the federal government, and CAP saying, can we hold off on that for just a little bit? Of course, the oil industry's just been hit with a triple whammy, not just COVID-19, but also the price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia. Environmental groups, though, are saying, listen, come on, this is the oil lobby. They've been trying to get out from under this environmental oversight forever, and now they're just using COVID-19 as an excuse. So we'll see where the federal government comes down on this. I suspect the PM may get a question or two about this when we see him in a couple of minutes.
Talk a little bit more as well about the emergency loan program and other offerings announced yesterday by the government, and really how much this will help, because you contrast that with a recent survey from small businesses who say, look, half of them past May don't even know if they'll be able to stay open. I guess the measures announced yesterday will help in some ways. It's difficult to exactly calculate how much, but what more can we expect, do you think?
Well, we do know that more than 200,000 small businesses have already availed themselves of the emergency loan backed by the federal government, a loan of $40,000. You get it from your financial institution. Yesterday, the Prime Minister is saying going to expand that to allow any small business with a payroll last year of between $20,000 and $1.5 million to apply for that emergency loan. Again, you get it from your bank. And then, as Abigail mentioned, there's a commercial rent relief program that the feds want to get underway. We're not sure when that's going to roll out, but that would let small businesses get a break on their rent from April, May, and June. And what you're going to hear today, we've been talking about small business. What you're going to hear today now is some bigger, broader industry kind of help. Oil and gas, airlines, tourism. These are industry sectors, this is why it's called sectoral help, that have been asking for unique kinds of help for their sector. And when we talk about liquidity, we're not talking about something to help workers in those industries. We're talking about actually saving the industry. So this is your definition of a, quote, corporate bailout. And the government has been very keen to be seen that it's not just going to bail out oil and gas. The Liberals are having a caucus meeting every single day. There's one minister in Trudeau's cabinet, Stephen Guilbeault, the Heritage Minister, who used to be a campaigner against the oil and gas industry. There's lots of Liberals who don't want to be bailing out oil and gas. This has been a big fight politically inside the Liberal caucus. One of the ways out of it politically is saying, okay, here oil and gas, here's your help airlines, here's your help manufacturing, here's your help tourism. We'll see if there's a one-size-fits-all package for the Prime Minister here. The oil and gas sector does have some unique needs because of the collapse in world oil prices that is not there with airlines, that is not there with tourism. It's a tricky political problem for the Prime Minister to manage, and that's might be one of the reasons it's taken them so long to get to this, despite, as you pointed out, Finance Minister Bill Morneau saying it'll be hours away, days away, 3 weeks ago.
And that was my next question. Why has it taken this long in many ways? I mean, obviously it's complicated by the political process. Do you think it's complicated by the relationships between the federal government, Justin Trudeau perhaps, and the provincial premiers? Is that a possibility?
I haven't heard that. In fact, even though Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, and Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, pre-COVID were often at loggerheads, they understand that everybody's got to row here together. So it's been very much a three-way negotiation on the oil and gas sector. Officials from the government of Alberta, and I should point out, government of Saskatchewan, government of Newfoundland and Labrador, all the oil-producing provinces, talking to the feds. They've been talking to the industry about the right kind of package here that can be helpful. And don't forget, the federal government's early priorities were support individuals. That's your Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which 5.5 million Canadians are now using. The second one was the wage subsidy program. And don't forget, some big airlines, WestJet Canada, are already going to use the wage subsidy program. Oil and gas players can use the wage subsidy program. But the next level now is making sure, particularly in the oil and gas sector, that medium-sized players can still get bank financing that they need to essentially maintain operations and maintain them safely. That has been the tricky thing to work out. It is complex, but it's a multi-party conversation that's been going on. And then, yes, there's been some politics mixed in with the federal Liberals. There is division within their own caucus just about what kind of support should go to the oil and gas sector.
And it's an interesting contrast because I'm just looking at the numbers. Oil now selling for less than $20 a share U.S., a startling number.
Oh, well, that is $18, I think, today. Yeah, off.
Yeah, a little more, 18.59 right now, which is incredibly difficult number to wrap your head around. At the same time, the TSX going in a different direction. It's actually up 275 points right now. So the market having a different reaction.
That's right, and I think that the TSX really following the lead of American stock markets right now. Yeah. I think what investors are looking at is they are hearing, as Jackson reported, signs that we may be getting to plans of reopening an economy, that some sectors, some states may be ready to start reopening. And here in Canada, New Brunswick's Premier Blaine Higgs suggesting that he may be ready to start thinking about reopening aspects of the economy, and that is good news for business. And so people are trying to get ahead of that, and I think that's why you're seeing stocks up. But still, we do know that so far as the price of oil is concerned, even though OPEC countries cut their global production by 10 million barrels a day, the excess that is being produced is 20 million barrels. So global demand has fallen by 20 million barrels. The cut is only 10 million barrels. We're still producing a ton of oil that nobody can use. And that's why we're talking in Alberta now. We talked about this yesterday, I think, with Heather Urix West, about negative.
Yeah, David was referring to the negative oil prices. Of course, that is just devastating for the economy, certainly in oil-producing provinces, Alberta, Newfoundland, Saskatchewan. So we'll try to regain some connection with David shortly on. But if you're just joining us, the Prime Minister delayed by a few minutes. We're told that is his home at Rideau Cottage. We're just awaiting the national address that he is given every day. So that should come any minute now, but he delayed by a few minutes. We'll keep on top of that, of course. Let's stay in Ottawa and bring in Abigail Beeman once again. And Abigail, we were talking before about long-term care homes and obviously the devastating situation there. Interesting response across the country in many ways because so many hundreds are dealing with outbreaks. Quebec asked for help, is getting help ostensibly. We'll find out some more details when it comes to that. Ontario as well, not ruling out requesting the military to assist there. I mean, obviously a lot of questions remain, but it just highlights how big the problem is across this country, especially in the two hardest hit provinces.
Well, absolutely. When you're talking about bringing in the military to help with a situation in long-term care homes, take a look at what happened in Quebec. The request to the federal government for that help came in Wednesday night. They're still working out the details now in terms of the specifics of what exactly the military can do, how many people will be going to help. The Deputy Prime Minister used the word urgent a number of times when she told reporters yesterday that the finer details were being rolled out. She spoke about the military. She also spoke about how perhaps the Red Cross could help in that situation. So waiting for some details. Important to note as well that François Legault, the premier in Quebec, he asked for the Army's help. He also put out a call to doctors who could help in long-term care homes, perhaps who are not able to perform their normal functions in their normal jobs because of COVID-19. And he got an overwhelming response. More than 2,000 doctors stepped up and offered to help. So wheels are in motion, but it is just an absolutely heartbreaking and critical situation at the front lines of these hundreds and hundreds of long-term care homes with outbreaks that we're hearing about right across the country.
Yeah, and a lot of questions now coming up why these long-term care homes weren't more prepared given how devastating the situation is playing out right there. Really, I mean, a lot of those questions will be hopefully answered as this kind of nears its end, but we are nowhere near that. And as we talked about, really this war on Canadian soil being fought on two fronts. We have the public health crisis underway and also the economic crisis underway. So let's talk about the CERB and the numbers there, pretty staggering as well. Do we have the latest numbers of people who have applied so far?
Sorry, Anthony, I'm just having some trouble hearing you over this line, but I think you're asking me about the CERB, and the government hasn't actually provided updated numbers since Monday in terms of the number of Canadians who have applied. We know that on Monday or over the weekend, that the latest information
Abigail, I'm going to have to jump in there. Forgive me. The Prime Minister is about to speak. Let's listen in.
This morning, I'd like to talk about the request for assistance we received from the Government of Quebec Wednesday and give you the latest news about medical equipment supplies. The Minister of Public Security worked with Quebec and the Minister of National Defence, and I can now confirm that there's some 125 members of the Canadian Armed Forces who are trained in healthcare will go to Quebec and help the workers in their long-term care facilities. We continue working with the Government of Quebec to find other ways of supporting them, including with the Red Cross and specialized volunteers that are registered with Health Canada. With regard to the supply of medical equipment, Bell Canada made a gift of 1.5 million of N95 masks, and we're working as quickly as possible to send them out to our first-line health workers. This is in addition to the million masks surgical masks that we sent to territories this week.
Created anxiety and uncertainty for all Canadians, but some are going through an especially tough time. COVID-19 has brought many industries to a halt, and workers across the country are struggling as a result. From the start, our goal as a government has been clear: to help all Canadians get through these challenging times. As I've said many times before, we're here to support you, to lend you a helping hand when you need it most. Across the country, Canadians are standing shoulder to shoulder, and we're all in this together. Today, our government is announcing more help for workers in Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC, and Newfoundland and Labrador. We're also announcing more help for small businesses and more help for those who work in the arts, culture, and sports sectors. I'll start with the energy sector. Right now, workers and families are struggling because of things beyond their control. Both the devastating effects of the pandemic and the price war driven by foreign interests are a challenge. As a result, companies have had to slow down or pause their operations, leaving too many people out of work. To help these workers, our government will invest $1.7 billion to clean up orphan and inactive wells in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC. These wells, which are no longer in use, can be detrimental not only to our environment, but to people's health. Think of the farmer who can't grow anything on his land because of an abandoned well a few steps away from his home. Think of the small town or Indigenous community struggling with this issue that has been festering for years or even decades. Cleaning them up will bring people back to work and help many landowners who've had these wells on their property for years but haven't been able to get them taken care of and the land restored. Our goal is to create immediate jobs in these provinces while helping companies avoid bankruptcy and supporting our environmental targets. In Alberta alone, these investments will maintain 5,200 jobs. We've listened to the concerns of landowners, municipalities, and Indigenous communities who want to make sure that the polluter pay principle is strengthened and that their voices are heard. I want to thank the Government of Alberta for working with us and listening to their concerns. Our government will also establish a $750 million emission reduction fund with a focus on methane to create and maintain jobs through pollution reduction efforts. This includes $75 million to help the offshore industry cut emissions in Newfoundland and Labrador. This fund will primarily provide repayable contributions to firms to make them more competitive, reduce waste and pollution, and most importantly, protect jobs. Right now, many energy firms are experiencing a cash crunch, so they don't have the funds to invest in technologies to reduce emissions or fix methane leaks. Today's announcement will allow for this kind of work to be done and create jobs people need during this difficult time. Through the wells and methane initiatives, we estimate that we will maintain roughly 10,000 jobs across the country. Just because we're in a health crisis doesn't mean we can neglect the environmental crisis. We're also working with BDC and EDC to expand credit support for at-risk medium-sized energy companies so they can maintain operations and keep their employees. Our government
will be giving $1.7 billion to clean up abandoned wells and orphan wells in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. The objective is to create employment for persons in the sector, avoid the businesses going bankrupt, and support the environment. These unused wells, no longer used to produce the oil, can present risks not only for the environment, but also for our health. By cleaning them up, we will create jobs for workers. We will also help people who have these abandoned wells on their land for some time and can't get rid of them. We foresee that these will allow us to provide 5,200 jobs in Alberta alone. We developed this policy with the Government of Alberta and our municipal partners, and I'd like to thank them for their contribution. Our government will also be implementing a fund of some $750 million to reduce emissions of methane in particular in order to create and maintain jobs. Of that amount, some $75 million will be given to the offshore producers in Newfoundland and Labrador in order to reduce their emission. This fund will be mainly reimbursable contributions given to companies to protect jobs, increase competitiveness, and reduce pollution. Currently, businesses in the energy sector are facing a cash crunch, which means they do not have the funds necessary to invest in technologies that help to reduce emissions or repair methane leaks. Today's announcement will allow businesses to undertake these work while creating jobs for workers during this difficult period we're going through. This public health crisis should not prevent us from acting against the climate crisis simultaneously. With this initiative to clean up the wells and the fund to reduce emissions, we estimate that some 10,000 jobs will be maintained. Simultaneously, we're also working with the BDC and EDC in order to reinforce the support for credit for mid-sized energy companies that are particularly at risk. Once again, the objective there is to allow businesses to continue their activities and keep their employees on the payroll.
Now, I want to turn to what we're going to do next for small businesses and the people they employ. Over the past few weeks, we've taken a number of steps to support these employers and mostly their employees. We introduced the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy to help keep people on the payroll. We launched and expanded the Canada Emergency Business Account for those businesses struggling with cash flow. But Ministers Joly, Ng, Baines, and others have heard that some businesses are still falling through the cracks. To fix that, our government will provide $962 million to regional development agencies and the Community Futures Network. This funding will help ensure that more businesses, especially smaller employees based in more rural parts of the country, or those who don't have a relationship with a traditional financial institution, are getting the support that they need. We're also going to give $270 million to Futurepreneur and the Industrial Research Assistance Program to support innovators and other early-stage development firms that don't qualify for the wage subsidy but still need help. Pour ce qui est des petites entreprises, on annonce aujourd'hui.
Now, for small businesses today, we are announcing two other investments. First, our government will pay out $962 million to regional development agencies and the Communities Futures Network. This money will allow us to offer the assistance necessary to small businesses that are not qualified for the Emergency Response Fund or to obtain a loan from the Emergency Fund for Businesses. Second, our government will provide $267 for Futurepreneur and others to support innovators and other people that are launching businesses but that are not eligible for the wage subsidy program. We also have news for those working in the arts, culture, and sports sectors. These industries, a little bit like small businesses that I just talked about, were not eligible oftentimes for the assistance we've already set up because their revenue models are different or they're not losing money in the same way. Since the beginning of the current crisis, artists have been bringing comfort, laughs, and happiness into our lives. Athletes continue to inspire us, encourage us, and appeal to our pride. Those who work in the areas of arts, culture, and sports are sharing their passion with us and make us dream. So these days, when we're all isolated at home, they make us feel a little bit less lonely. These are but some of the reasons for which we should be there for them, as they are for us. Our government will therefore be giving $500 million to Canadian Heritage to support our artists, our creators, and our rising sports stars. Thanks to these funds, these people will be able to receive salary support, and organizations will have access to financing if they have cash flow problems.
Give $500 million to Heritage Canada to support those who work in the arts, culture, and sports sectors. Like the small businesses I was talking about, people and businesses in these sectors do not have access to some of the help we've announced because of how the companies operate or how revenues are generated. With this investment, people will be able to receive wage support, and organizations that are struggling with cash flow will be able to access financing. At the same time, we continue to support those who've lost their jobs with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. So far, over 7.5 million payments have been made. That's money sent directly to those who need it most. I want to again thank our amazing public servants who are processing these claims at record speeds. Moving forward, we will be releasing the latest figures on the CERB through the government's open data portal 3 times a week, so academics, researchers, and Canadians can keep track of the work being done. We will continue to provide and open up data so that we can get the best advice from experts and continue to help Canadians. I want to end this morning by reminding everyone that today is the 38th anniversary of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which underpins who we are as a country and who we strive to be as a people. It protects the right of each and every one of us to be who we are, to worship how we want, to love whom we love. At the heart of the Charter is the notion of choice, that we can choose the kind of life we want for ourselves. As our country confronts this pandemic, I'm especially grateful that Canadians have chosen to protect each other and care for one another. To everyone who has stayed home and followed public health recommendations, thank you. Making that choice together today will ensure that we remain who we are as Canadians for generations to come. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Je suis maintenant content de prendre les questions.
Thank you, everybody. I'll now answer questions. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. We'll start the question period with the phone operator.
Merci. Thank you. The first question, Dylan Robertson, Winnipeg Free Press, line open.
Prime Minister, you've expressed a preference for virtual parliament. Many regions of Canada have terrible internet connections, and they tend to be the ones that feel the most ignored by Ottawa. Are you comfortable with having virtual sittings if MPs can't participate in real time from their homes?
Obviously, the point of virtual sittings would be to ensure that Canadians who are not within driving distance of Ottawa continue to have their views represented and their concerns heard. That is a technological challenge that we will work very, very hard on to ensure that as we move forward on virtual Parliament solutions, as the Speaker and the House of Commons work on that, that we make sure that every voice can be heard of the 338 Canadians. At the same time, we have proposed to the opposition parties that Parliament could come back every single week to discuss legislation and to ensure that there is accountability. We need to make sure that our democracy continues to function, and this is something that we are very serious about. We recognize right now, on the books, there is a rule that says that 338 MPs need to get on flights Friday or Sunday evening to come back to Ottawa on Monday morning as Parliament is supposed to resume. That is obviously not a good idea. We are not in normal circumstances, so we're negotiating with all opposition parties to try and make sure we can find a way to keep the important work of our democracy going while at the same time respecting public health advice.
D'abord, de regarder un parlement virtuel. Well, in order to have a virtual parliament, it's important to ensure that this will allow deputies throughout the country to share the concerns of their constituents, and that is why we're working with the parties in the House to ensure that we find the technological solutions allowing this. We also recognize that it's important our democracy continue to be at work, and that is why we proposed that Parliament can sit weekly in order to vote bills and ensure that accountability is met and that the government answers questions. We hope that the opposition parties will accept our proposal, because otherwise Parliament is supposed to sit with its 338 members on Monday morning, and I think that that's not a good idea right now.
Prime Minister, the Manitoba Premier has asked for an emergency credit agency to access better interest rates. Governor Polo says that your government did not ask the Bank of Canada to help with the provincial debt market. He said no one has asked us to do anything on the provincial front. The Premier has also asked to put public servants on EI. Today's job announcement doesn't hit the provincial debt markets. So my question is, when will the provinces learn what you're doing for their debts and what is already off the table?
I had an excellent conversation last night with the premiers of all the provinces and territories. This issue was brought up, and I assured them that Finance Canada is looking at it. We recognize that different provinces carry different debt loads and different challenges on access to credit. The Bank of Canada has taken significant measures that have had a positive impact on provincial coffers. At the same time, we will continue to make sure that provinces across the country are able to give the support they need to give to their citizens.
Thank you. Next question, moderator.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Outbreak, Huffington Post. Line open.
Good morning, Prime Minister. You've announced a number of measures today and also earlier this week changes to help those with some income apply for the CRB. You've lowered the threshold for some business owners to apply for interest-free loans. But still, a number of people I've spoken with this week are not impacted by any of these changes. What should people in these positions, people who are left out and who have a hard time making ends meet, do? Should they apply for the CRB or should they wait for your government to come up with another fix?
From the very beginning, we knew we had to help as many people as we possibly could who needed the help as quickly as possible. That's why we moved forward with two very big, very strong programs, both the Canada Emergency Response Benefit that has sent out over 7.5 million payments already, and the wage subsidy, which will kick in a few weeks, which is allowing employers to rehire their employees so that when the economy bounces back, people will still have those links to their jobs while they are supported in this time of difficulty. But from the beginning, we recognized that moving quickly and broadly would leave gaps. And that's why over the past weeks, we have been announcing almost every single day new measures that tweak the proposals we've made, that expand other proposals, that create new initiatives to try and make sure we're getting help to everyone who needs them. The announcements we've made today around help for the arts and cultural sectors, for sporting organizations, for small businesses like startups, for small businesses in rural areas, for the range of workers in the energy sector who are facing layers of calamity right now, are the kinds of things that we're making sure that everyone is getting the help we need. We are continuing to listen to Canadians who are expressing that they are not getting the help they need, and we are constantly looking for ways to help them.
Follow-up question?
Yeah, thank you. So are you basically saying wait until the government comes up with another fix? Because, as you know, on Saturday, MPs voted to support a motion that basically said that if you need help, the government is going to ensure that if you applied for CERB and you weren't supposed to be eligible, that you would be unjustly penalized. So is the government saying that the worst thing that will happen to you if you apply for CERB but don't actually qualify, that you will have to pay the money back in full next year? Is that the worst thing that will happen to people who apply for CERB because they feel they need it?
We expect people to apply for the programs for which they qualify, and we are therefore working to make sure we're expanding the qualifications so that people who need the help will get them. We will continue to announce measures that will include more and more people, help more and more people as we move forward, because for all the millions of people and companies and businesses and employers that we're helping across this country, we know there is more to do, and that's what we're continually announcing almost every day, new measures to fix support for people in particular situations. We recognize
that the programs that we had to create quickly in order to help the most people possible are not adapted for people in particular situations. That is why for several weeks now, almost every day we have been announcing changes, widening of the various programs in order to allow people to receive more help according to the various programs we're making available. Next question, moderator.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Marie Vastel, Le Devoir.
Marie Vastel, Le Devoir. Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to come back to your assistance program for the oil sector. Many people were expecting that you would do more. Some had suggested that the government purchase shares in the oil companies like they did for car companies in the 2008 crisis. Are you prepared to do so? And if not, why not? Our emphasis from the outset was to help Canadians who are in trouble, help families, people who need assistance. That is why we put up the wage subsidy and the CERB in order to help millions of Canadians in all industries throughout the country. Now, but we also saw clearly that the oil industry is facing particular challenges because of what's happening on the international markets with the price of oil, and also because of a lowering demand due to the disease. So with all of these challenges, we thought we had to do a little bit more, and that is just what we're doing. We will continue to see if more needs to be done, but we want to always ensure, first and foremost, that we are helping families and workers who need help in this emergency situation.
Took as an approach from the very beginning that we need to help Canadians. We need to help workers and families who are hit by this COVID-19 slowdown and shutdown. That's why we move forward with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit that has helped millions upon millions of Canadians, and the wage subsidy, which has allowed companies to rehire workers and will ensure that families across the country get much more support. And that is across all industries, across the country. However, we recognize that certain industries are facing even more difficult times. The oil and gas sector, because of the global price war, because of the lower demand related to COVID, and because of the measures brought in to counter COVID itself, those families are particularly hard hit. And that's where this initiative, which will create or preserve 5,200 jobs in Alberta, and the other initiatives, which will lead to perhaps 10,000 jobs across the energy sector, are the kinds of things that we can do right now. Of course, we will continue to work with partners and concerned sectors across the country as we move forward to see if there's a need to do more.
En suivi, Marie?
Follow-up question. Yes, some feared that before your announcement today that your position might be influenced by some of the personal positions of some of your members of your cabinet about the oil and gas sector. You're now talking about assistance to clean up abandoned wells, to fight against gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. What are you answering to those who are disappointed with the extent of the program and who will accuse you of having been unduly influenced by the position of some members of your cabinet? Answer: the personal convictions of members of the cabinet, and we've always been united on that, is to help Canadians in need, to fight against the COVID-19 crisis and to ensure that we get through it and continue to be an extraordinary country in the years to come. That's our priority. That is why the assistance we sent to workers with the two main measures, the CERB and the wage subsidy, are there for all. But we're also doing more, which was asked for by the government of Alberta for some time now, to help clean up abandoned wells, to ensure that the companies who have to reduce their emissions even more have the funds necessary to undertake the measures necessary to reduce it, in particular methane. That is the choice we made to help Canadians and to prepare for us a future in which all Canadians will find themselves at home and have a better job. Last question for the telephone person, operator.
Prochaine question, Mélanie Marquis, La Presse.
Mélanie Marquis, La Presse. Thank you. Good day, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to come back to the use of the military in Quebec. Where will these military personnel come from? What will be their role? And why are there only so few of them? When the long-term care facilities are in a very difficult situation, Vision. Answer, we worked with the government of Quebec yesterday in order to put together an assistance package. These 125 members of the Canadian Forces will bring important help to the Quebec long-term care facilities. We recognize that we could have more done with the Red Cross and the Bank of Volunteers that we have at Health Canada. Quebec also has a Bank of Volunteers, by the way, that they're calling upon, and we will continue to help in the best way possible, always trying to do more. But the situation with the forces is that we're limited by medical considerations in all organizations, including the Canadian Forces. Follow-up question, Mélanie? Just to get a little bit more on that, I realize that there's some medical restrictions here, but they could do other things. And I know that there's a need for that. And Mr. Trudeau, according to information that I'm hearing, an agreement was reached with the United States about the border. Could you speak to that, please? Yes. As I've always said, we are in continuous discussions with our southern neighbor, partner, and friend in order that we have, both of us, the means to protect our Canadians. My priority is always to protect Canadians, and we'll continue to work with the Americans to ensure that the borders remain safe. As I've often said, I do not expect that border to be reopened in the short term. We will continue to listen to what science is telling us and to monitor very closely the evolution of the virus here in Canada and throughout the world before making decisions. And our discussions with the Americans remain positive, and they continue.
Conversations are constant and ongoing with the American administration on issues of mutual concern, including the border. As I've said, we do not feel that reopening the border anytime soon is likely. My responsibility is to ensure the protection and safety of Canadians. That is what we will continue to do, and the conversations with the Americans have been extremely aligned and extremely productive.
Glenn McGregor, CTV News. Prime Minister, for weeks now, you have been promising relief and aid for the energy sector. What you've announced today is going to help a comparatively small number of workers. It isn't going to do anything for the sector overall to help deal with devastating impact of this virus and the downturn in the world oil markets. My question is this it? Is this the package you were promising? And if so, what do you say to people in Western Canada, particularly, who was expecting more substantial relief?
The first things we did was move forward with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit that's putting money in the pockets of more than 7 million Canadians, including many people in the oil and gas sector who've lost their paychecks because of this COVID-19 crisis. On top of that, the wage subsidy allows Canadian workers to continue to receive their salaries, to continue to stay connected to their work in the oil and gas sector, which are significant helps for a major industry across this country. On top of that, we've been working with the government of Alberta and with industry to look at other things that can be necessary. We heard very clearly that the methane regulations that we are bringing in will be a challenge for industries to meet, and industry and others asked that we therefore back off on the methane regulations. We decided instead to lend them money to help them keep people working to upgrade and update their measures so we can continue to fight climate change and reduce emissions while keeping people at work. We've also heard very clearly, and not just from industry, but from municipalities, particularly rural municipalities, landowners across Alberta, that the issue of persistent orphan or inactive wells is a real challenge. And this is an opportunity for us to make sure that Albertans are getting to work in cleaning up their province, at the same time as we've gotten commitments by the government of Alberta to strengthen the regulations so we see fewer orphan and inactive wells in the future. We've also made credit available for medium-sized oil and gas companies who are facing particular challenges in terms of liquidity right now. We will continue to look at ways we can support important industries in this country, including the oil and gas sector. We look forward to doing that while at the same time keeping our focus squarely on families and workers who need our help.
Prime Minister Julie Van Dusen, CBC News. You spoke to the premiers last night, so I'm hoping you can update us on this. Blaine Higgs, as an example, has said he's hoping to get his economy going by the summer. John Horgan this morning on CBC said that he and his Washington state counterpart could decide when the border opens. So I'm wondering, who decides all this? Is it you? Is it them? And if it is you, will there be national standards to guide them?
We talked last night about how important it is to be coordinated and agreed on the principles and the approaches that we take, while at the same time recognizing that the situation in PEI is very different from the situation in Ontario, very different from the situation in BC. There will be regional approaches, as there have been all along, to the next steps, but we all agreed that we need to continue to remain very, very vigilant as we carefully look at reopening the economy, about relaunching certain sectors in the future. We will continue our coordination around the principles and the steps that need to be taken. But of course, this is Canada, which means that there are very different needs and very different approaches that will be in place across the country. What we will be working on to coordinate and collaborate on is ensuring that the messages that get out and that the lens that we take and the data that we collect and the way we do this is aligned and coordinated so that we can maximize our chances of getting through this without having to fall back into self-isolation the way we have been these past few weeks.
One of the principles that we agreed upon with premiers is the importance of coordinating our efforts to collaborate to ensure that the steps taken about reopening the economy and the relaxing of the rules about social distancing and confinement be done in a coordinated fashion. Obviously, different provinces and regions will have different needs corresponding to their realities, and we recognize and respect that, obviously. However, if we can ensure good coordination so that Canadians understand that the same principles are being applied everywhere throughout the country and that we collect the data in the same fashion and we analyze the situation and answer in a vigilant fashion and with a uniform approach, it will maximize our possibility of getting through the crisis without having to impose more confinement or economic downturn.
Oil and gas lobby group says the federal government should consider suspending dozens of environmental regulations, laws, and policies due to the economic and health crisis triggered by COVID-19. Critics call it a crass attempt to exploit the pandemic. How do you respond to the letter? And are some of the 30 requests still being considered by the government?
Just because we are in one crisis right now doesn't mean we can forget about the other crisis, the climate crisis that we are also facing as a world, as a country. But we recognize that For example, moving ahead with the methane regulations is something very difficult for companies right now in the oil and gas sector who are strained because of the multiple challenges they're facing both on the global stage and on the lower demand. That's why we're making investments in supporting those companies directly so that they can meet those methane reduction targets with funds that we're giving them so that we can stay on track to protect future generations and to reduce emissions from our industry. This is something that Canadians understand, that we need to continue to move forward, but we need to help people in different ways as we move forward. That will be the lens that we take.
And on a separate matter, China has revised its numbers on the Wuhan deaths, increasing them by 50%. Do you think this is a statistical verification, as China claims, or proof they covered it up?
I think we all need to be very attentive to how data flows around the world and be very thoughtful about how we process different information and how we apply the lessons learned from elsewhere around the world to what we do. We will continue to work with partners and allies and international institutions and organizations as we figure out how to get through today and tomorrow. But there will be many questions to ask once we are through this on how various countries behaved and what sort of principles we need to learn from and conclusions we need to draw as we move forward. Je pense que nous avons besoin.
I believe we need to have a close look at the numbers put forward by various countries in the world. Obviously, we will have to draw some conclusion eventually about the behavior of various countries, but for now, we're called to work together and to collaborate and do everything we need to do to learn and better protect our citizens at home.
Prime Minister, other world leaders have raised serious questions about China's handling of this pandemic and whether it holds responsibility for not containing it within its borders. It's not just the White House, it's also leaders in France and the United Kingdom. Here at home, your government has taken the opposite approach, with one former Canadian ambassador calling Ottawa's approach almost humiliating. In your answer just now, you didn't even mention China by name. So why is your government so reluctant to acknowledge China's possible faults in this pandemic?
My job right now is to make sure that Canadians get the best support, the best protection, and are able to get through this as best we possibly can. That means getting the equipment that we need. That means ensuring that the cooperation and the collaboration on the international stage is done properly. That means focusing right now on today and tomorrow and how we're going to keep Canadians safe. There will be plenty of time to point fingers, to ask questions, to draw conclusions, and to ensure that there are consequences for things that different countries may have done during this pandemic. Right now, my job is to look out for Canadians. Okay. Ma responsabilité en tant que Premier ministre.
My job as Prime Minister is to take care of the health and security of Canadians, and that is what I am doing and that I will continue doing. We will continue to work with various countries and the international institutions to ensure that we're doing everything necessary to get through this crisis. And after that, yes, there will be questions, there will be some thinking needed, and there might even be consequences for various countries according to how they acted during this global crisis. But for now, I must remain fixed on what's important for Canadians.
Are you suggesting, I guess, that, China might withhold PPE or something? Is that why you're not mentioning China, as you still continue to do? And on Julie's question about the way out of this, what level of testing do we need to see across Canada in order to start reopening the economy?
We've looked at the need for many more tests. We see that testing has been a key part of controlling the spread, not just knowing who has developed COVID and can pass it on, but actually being able to control the spread through contact tracing, through isolation and quarantine measures, testing is a key part of it. We need to continue to ramp up our testing capacities. We need to do a better job of coordinating on testing methodology and approaches across the provinces so that we can have a better vision of what is exactly happening. But testing certainly needs to increase as we move forward. Fortunately, it is increasing as we move forward.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau, Philippe Vincent, Président Radio-Canada. Sur les 125 militaires.
On the 125 medical military being sent to Quebec, how many are doctors, how many are nurses, where do they come from? Are doctors being removed from civilian hospitals? And in particular, at what point in time will they be able to go to the long-term care facilities? Answer, for the details, we'll be giving you that in the upcoming hours, but I can tell you that already this afternoon, some members of the Canadian Forces will be showing up in Quebec to evaluate the best approach to take. And in the days to come, we will see a large number of those 125 military arrive on the ground in Quebec. And on the $500 million for artists, etc., where is it going to go, to whom, how? Why isn't it CERB for them? Why special fund? I'd like to point out that the Minister Guilbeault and other of my ministers will be giving you a press conference in a couple of minutes, and we'll be able to answer all those questions and other questions on how to help artists now. But we do recognize that it is a situation where many artists are facing real difficulty, and we need artists. We need them to help us continue dreaming, even in these dark times, in particular during these dark times, and that's why we want to be there to help them. Thank you very much, and this is it for the press conference today. Thank you, everybody.
And that wraps up Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's address to the nation, going a little over time that it usually goes. Let's bring in David Akin. Of course, a lot to get to, a lot to dissect. As predicted, he discussed help for the oil and gas industry. It's interesting, isn't it, David? Because, as outlined in the questions, this isn't exactly the panacea, $1.7 billion, but more specifically to help clean up orphan wells. Sort of break down what you heard.
Yeah, and so the orphan wells issue has been a really big issue in Alberta, and there's been a lot of discussion about who ought to be responsible for cleaning them up. So what happens is an oil company comes into a farmer's land and makes some sort of arrangement to say, we want to grab the resource under your land. Fine, they drill, and then the company goes out of business, and they just leave the well there, and there's no money and no funding to clean it up. There's lots and lots and lots of these wells in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so, as I say, the discussion in those two provinces has been who's going to pay for it. It's usually been the province should pay for it. The province gets the royalties on the resource extraction, so the province should pay for it. So in this case, it looks like, no, actually the federal taxpayer is going to come to the rescue and pay for cleaning up orphan wells. And in doing so, we'll create some work. I think it was 4,000 or 5,000 jobs is what the Prime Minister said will be created in terms of cleaning up orphan wells. So it's an important issue, but it's also an environmental issue. It is not an issue related to the production of more fuel, more oil, more gas. It's related to essentially ameliorating an environmental problem. So that's one thing. Then there's another big fund, $500 million for a methane reduction or an emissions reduction fund that's primarily aimed at those who are emitting methane. Some of this money will go to Newfoundland, Labrador operations, offshore operations there. Again, there'll be some jobs created, but I think you'd see this very much in line of another environmental policy. So the PM's aid for the oil and gas sector that was announced, though the headline that was announced today, you could very much fit in with this is the Trudeau government's continuing efforts to do something about climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and clean up the environment, as opposed to bailing out a big, huge oil company. Now, that said, and I think this one under the radar, is the Prime Minister said there will be instructions given to the BDC and the EDC, Export Development Canada and the Business Development Corporation, Business Development Canada. These are two federal organizations that can backstop loans, and they will be instructed to backstop loans to medium-sized, at-risk energy players. And just give me a second, let me explain what this means by at-risk energy players. So some medium-sized energy companies would have had a line of credit or some sort of credit arrangement with their bank that would be dependent on maintaining certain ratios of sales to assets or sales to liabilities. So again, you get the credit if you maintain your business. Well, the business has fallen through the floor because of oil prices. And so the banks now come to the business and say, sorry, you cannot access your line of credit. That's the liquidity crunch that the business has right now. So forget about wage subsidies, that's not going to help. Forget about individual payments to workers, that's not going to help. This is the businesses at risk because the bank has said you're in violation of your loan and credit covenants. In comes the BDC, in comes the EDC to say, okay, we got it. We will be the backstop on some of these energy companies to make sure that they can still access the credit that they already had negotiated with their banks. We'll see if this works. We'll be very curious to see the reaction. The early reaction, though, generally is, I was looking at Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, looking at his Twitter feed. He's already saying thumbs up to the cleaning up the orphaned oil gas wells. He likes that a lot. A lot of economists also saying this is an important problem and we might as well use this crisis to deal with that. But billions and billions, I mean, I know that Alberta's Energy Minister, Sonia Savage, at one point earlier this week was thinking there'd be a $20 to $30 billion liquidity bailout. It may yet be. We'll see how much the EDC and the BDC go into the market now to help some of these energy companies. But that will be the devil will be in those details. How many companies now go to the BDC and EDC and access some of the essentially guarantees that will now be offered them?
A lot to uncover there, and the big question is how the money will be doled out. Of course, we'll explore that as we continue this. David, as always, thank you so much for all of your insight. Let's stay in Ottawa and bring in Abigail Beeman right now. And Abigail, we talked about the people who are not necessarily under this umbrella. That umbrella got a little bit bigger today. Talk about that and really who was left out, if you could.
That's right. So there was more help announced, hundreds of millions of dollars in more help announced to trickle down to small businesses that have not yet been helped by measures on the table so far. The Prime Minister specifically mentioning rural small businesses without a connection to a major financial institution. There'd be some help there through the regional economic development funds. Also help for arts and culture and athletes, $500 million for Heritage Canada. So a number of new initiatives announced. Still a lot of questions about how that help can be accessed, who is eligible, how it will all work outside of the major programs that are already on the table. And still a lot of questions in the air, generally stepping back from businesses for students, for example, people with disabilities. There are still hundreds of thousands of Canadians who are ineligible for both the CERB as well as employment insurance. But as you say, the Prime Minister trying to broaden the net in terms of who can get some of this federal help. Anthony.
All right, Abigail, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. And have a good weekend as well. So if you're just joining us, let's give a quick recap. The Armed Forces as well sending 125 members to Quebec to help with long-term care homes. That was sort of not really discussed in great detail. Of course, big issues and a lot of people now helped by the more offerings from the government. The energy sector, of course, a big recipient of that. We'll explore that on all of your Global News platforms, globalnews.ca and Global National. For everyone here, I'm Anthony Robert. Have a great weekend.
To get this done, without slipping backwards, all Canadians need to continue to stay home and practice physical distancing.
Another feature of the COVID-19 outbreak in Canada to be aware of as we measure our progress is the different character and intensity of spread depending on where you are in the country. Although our 4 largest provinces continue to report the bulk of cases in Canada, the highest case numbers have been coming out of Quebec and Ontario recently. At this important juncture, intense public health efforts are needed to stamp out existing outbreaks, prevent new outbreaks, and trace and manage chains of transmission in the community. To get this done, without slipping backwards, all Canadians need to continue to stay at home and practice physical distancing. All ears are perked for news of when and how we might get into an easing of these strict public health measures. Some areas will experience the epidemic slowdown earlier than others, but no matter where we are in the country, we've got to remember that Canadians are highly susceptible to the virus. Unless we all remain diligent in maintaining our new habits of physical distancing and good hygiene, new outbreaks can be sparked anywhere at any time. So remember, this is not a sprint, it is a marathon, and there will only be unpleasant surprises if we quit early. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tam. And now we will hear from our Minister of Finance, Bill Morneau. Bill, please.
Well, thank you very much, Christia. It's good to be here with you even remotely today. I think, as you know, and as Canadians know, we've been very focused on supporting people through the course of all the initiatives we've taken on an economic front, and today is particularly important in that regard. You've seen us put forward ways to support people with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. We know that some organizations have not been able to fully get access to those programs, including the business account for small businesses. So today we're announcing significant funding to help those small businesses in rural communities in particular that might not get access to the Canada Emergency Business Account or might not be eligible to the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. We also know that among the places hardest hit in our country are the cultural sector, the arts and the culture and the sports sector. Les scènes étant vides, les espaces événementiels fermés et les festivals d'été reportés.
Festivals have been postponed, and as a result, many talented Canadians are out of work. The COVID-19 Fund for Cultural and Heritage, as well as sports organizations, will ensure that our artists and others will be financially protected.
Towards the ability to support those organizations in the arts and culture and sports area that have not been able to get access to the Canada Emergency Business Account or the Canada Emergency Wage Support. So that's funding that will go through Heritage Canada that I know my colleague Stephen Guilbeault will be talking about. And then finally, we know that there are many startup companies, companies that are just getting going that might not be able to have access to the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy or the Emergency Business Account. So we're putting money in that regard as well towards those firms. And I know my colleague Navdeep Bains will be talking about that. We also recognize that there's a real importance to supporting jobs in parts of our country that have been particularly hard hit, in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador. So I'm very pleased to talk about some initiatives today that will support people in those regions, in particular in the energy sector. We've got, importantly, a program where we're going to provide significant support in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, and in British Columbia for the remediation of orphan oil wells, and abandoned oil wells. So we'll be putting forth funding directly to the Oil Wells Association in Alberta, and together with the government in Alberta and Saskatchewan and British Columbia, supporting abandoned wells so that we can create employment and also deal with an environmental problem. We're also moving forward on providing $750 million in loans to companies in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador to reduce their methane emissions. So it's going to create jobs and at the same time allow us to reduce our environmental situation. So we're trying to make sure that we're putting money somewhere that will have the biggest impact both today and over the long term. Finally, what we know is so important to, especially to firms in the energy sector, is they need access to credit. So we're very pleased today to talk about credit on a commercial basis for mid-sized firms in the energy sector to help them to bridge through a really difficult time and be able to support their business, but also to support their employees. So from that perspective, what we're announcing today is very much important for jobs, supporting people across the country that might not get access to some of the programs we've announced, and helping people in particular in the energy sector to have support so they can have jobs or create jobs that will be very helpful to places that are particularly hard hit. So with that, Christia, I'll say thank you and look forward to if there's any questions later.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill. Now we'll hear from our Minister of Natural Resources, Seamus O'Regan. Seamus, please. We can't hear Seamus. Seamus, we can't hear you. Have you turned on?
It's on.
Perfect. We can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Every time. Every time. Thank you. So every day over the past few weeks, I have been listening to workers and business owners and industry leaders in the energy sector. And living here in Newfoundland and Labrador, I know firsthand how hard Canada's petroleum industry has been hit. Canada is the fourth largest producer of oil in the world. It is an industry that employs over 576,000 Canadians from right across the country, including 11,000 Indigenous workers. It is an industry made up of more than 4,500 businesses, the vast majority of which are small and medium-sized. It's an industry facing not one, but two fundamental crises, the impacts of COVID-19 and a subsequent drop in global demand of 30 to 35%, and the impacts of a price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia that flooded the market with underpriced product. Many of the measures that we have already announced are helping energy companies and their workers, including the Canada Emergency Business Account and the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. Internationally, we're working with the G20, the International Energy Agency, and our U.S. partners to bring price stability to the oil market. Today, as Bill pointed out, we are doing more. Our goal here is twofold. First, it addresses the short-term liquidity needs of these companies. This is what both industry and labor have told me is their most immediate priority. Firms will be able to stay afloat for workers to have jobs to come back to. Secondly, to support the energy sector's transition to net zero, we are providing funding in two areas: cleaning up orphaned and inactive wells and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Orphan and inactive well cleanup offers an opportunity to put our highly skilled people to work right away. In addition, Natural Resources Canada will provide $750 million to help companies invest in technologies that will help them reduce their methane emissions. And $75 million of this funding is particularly earmarked for capital investments and research geared towards emissions reductions in the offshore energy sector to make the Newfoundland and Labrador industry even more competitive internationally. And we will continue to work over the weeks ahead on other ways that we can maintain our workforce and make them more competitive internationally. Thank you, merci beaucoup. Back to you, Christia.
Okay, thank you, Seamus. Et maintenant, je donne la parole au ministre du Patrimoine canadien, Stephen
We'll
Guilbeault.
now go to Stephen Guilbeault, the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
La COVID-19 et les mesures de santé publique ont bouleversé notre
public
quotidien.
health measures have
J'aimerais
had
vous
an impact
demander
on our daily
que
lives.
faites-vous pendant cette période
like to
d'éloignement
ask you,
physique?
What are you
Vous
doing
lisez les
during
nouvelles,
physical
regardez un
distancing?
film,
Watching the
une
news,
émission de télé,
watching a movie,
vous êtes
TV,
plongé dans un bon livre ou encore dans une
reading a good
exposition
book,
virtuelle.
looking at a virtual
Many of us are following
exhibit.
not only our artists, but our favorite athletes who inspire us to get involved in sports. Le gouvernement du Canada est très conscient de l'effet dévastateur de la pandémie
The government
sur les
is
milieux
very
de la
proud
culture,
to
du
provide
patrimoine
assistance
et des sports.
to
Nous
these
tenons
sectors.
plus fortement que jamais derrière ceux et celles
We
qui
stand
colorent nos vies
behind
grâce à
those
leurs
who
œuvres,
are
leurs passions et leurs
using their
talents.
passion and their works
The government
to
of Canada
liven
will
our
provide
lives.
$500 million to establish a COVID-19 emergency support fund for cultural, heritage and sports organizations. Le gouvernement du Canada débloquera $500 millions pour établir un fonds
Minister
d'urgence
Guilbeault, the
destiné aux
government will
organisations
provide $500
de la
million
culture,
for
du
organizations
patrimoine
in
et
culture,
des sports.
heritage, and sport.
This targeted measure will provide financial support that is consistent with the government's existing COVID-19 support measures for wage and fixed costs for organization. It will be administered by Canadian Heritage with the support of many of our partners, such as the Canada Council for the Arts. Nous allons travailler avec le secteur de la culture, du patrimoine et du sport pour préciser les modalités de cet appui financier. Nous faisons tout en notre possible pour répondre à vos préoccupations les plus pressantes.
Your most
Nous
pressing
le faisons pour
concerns,
assurer votre survie,
to
votre
ensure
stabilité,
your
et
survival,
pour que les Canadiennes et les
stability,
Canadiens
and so that
continuent
Canadians
d'avoir
continue
un
to
accès à un
have
contenu
access
culturel et au milieu
to
sportif
cultural
parmi les
content
meilleurs au
and
monde.
sports
Our government
activities
has
which are
also
the best in
decided
the
to
world.
celebrate Canada Day differently this year. Canada Day will be hosted virtually. La population canadienne relève l'un des plus grands défis de notre histoire récente, et c'est ensemble, dans un environnement virtuel, que nous allons célébrer notre force, notre résilience et nos valeurs d'entraide
as well as our values at Canada Day. Our creators and athletes are providing us with a number of examples of inspiration
As we let them
and
into our
solidarity.
personal lives, we are reminded each day how fortunate we are to have such talent here in Canada. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Stephen. Et maintenant, je donne la parole au ministre du Développement
Mr.
économique,
Freeland, thank you, Stephen. We'll now go to Minister Joly.
Au cours des dernières semaines, j'ai eu l'occasion de
In
tenir
recent weeks, I've had an opportunity to have several discussions with a number of heads of chambers of commerce across the country, from Gaspésie to Montreal, Quebec, Moncton, and Edmonton. What they've all said is that this crisis is hitting them hard. They've shared their concerns with me, their reality, their anxiety, and we have heard the message. Our objective today, in conjunction with the Minister of Finance, is to protect our streets, our small communities. We are doubling the budgets of our economic development agencies across the country. So essentially, $1 billion in additional funding will go to these development agencies across the country, be it in the east, the middle of Canada, the west, or the north. What we've heard is that access to financial institutions is oftentimes more difficult. So our objective is this. We want to prevent entrepreneurs from falling through the cracks when they have a critical role to play in their communities. Through our development and community futures organizations, which do excellent work on the ground, we will be in a position to help companies to have access to various government measures to help them make it through the crisis. The development agencies in Canada work locally, bring the government into the communities, and defend the economic reality there. It's also responsible for helping during crises, as it has in the past in Fort McMurray, for example, during the fires.
Recently, I had good discussions with business owners via different chambers of commerce, from Surrey to Charlottetown, and of course, Saskatoon and St. John's. And we know the crisis is hitting hard. We heard many of the business owners' anxieties and preoccupations, and we've heard them. Our main objective today is to make sure that we protect our main streets all across the country. This is why we're answering the call by nearly doubling the budget of our different regional development agencies across this country, from Atlantic Canada to Quebec, Ontario, the West, and Northern Canada, so the Northern Territories. The idea is to provide to businesses, to support businesses that may be falling through the cracks and are playing vital roles within their communities. We're doing also another thing by making sure that we're increasing the budget of our community's futures organizations that are key to our local businesses. And the idea is to make sure that we support them while they're doing great work on the ground. So the mission of the agencies is to make sure that they're the eyes and ears of the federal government on the ground, and they're always there in times of crisis, maybe to deal with the Fort McMurray fires or the Lac Mégantic tragedy. So today, what we're saying to business owners across this country is we've got your back.
Okay, thank you very much, Melanie. And now we will hear from our Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, Navdeep Bains. Nav, please.
Thank you very much, Christia. In every industry and sector, companies are stepping up to lend a hand wherever possible. Les entreprises de tous les secteurs et de toutes les industries se portent à l'aide des Canadiens dans la mesure du possible.
And helping
In today's announcement,
people as much as they
it's
can.
about the other side of that coin. Canadian businesses and highly skilled innovators that we will help in this period of uncertainty. You know, during the normal course of things, one of the important roles of government is providing economic support to high potential, innovative firms in the early stages of development. Especially in a country like Canada, where where science and innovation are our strengths. Time and time again, these innovative small and medium-sized companies become key economic drivers for long-term growth in good quality jobs for all Canadians. We sometimes call them the future gazelles of Canada's economy, since they end up putting Canada leaps and bounds ahead of the competition. Now, government is in a unique position of being able to protect these important companies and the highly skilled people they employ through the National Research Council's Industrial Research Assistance Program, called IRAP. These innovative companies contribute disproportionately more to the success of the Canadian economy. But right now, many are facing real challenges because of the economic downturn resulting from COVID-19. They're looking at supply chain disruptions, cash flow issues, a collapse in demand, and therefore an inability to maintain staff to perform research and development. And we've heard from the startup community that some of these early stage firms do not qualify for the wage subsidy or business liquidity measures we've announced. We've heard the call for help from this part of the Canadian business community, and today we're answering it by injecting $250 million into the Industrial Research Assistance Program. This is an investment to protect Canada's highly skilled innovators. This support will be targeted to companies identified as strategic to the Canadian economy, impacted by COVID-19, whether they are pre-revenue or not. Ce soutien sera offert de façon ciblée aux entreprises qui sont stratégiques pour l'économie du Canada.
Companies.
I encourage any technology or innovation-based business that is unable to access the current support measures to go on to the National Research Council's website today, and they will be able to sign up to be notified when the application opens early next week. With today's announcement, we expect to support over 1,000 Canadian innovative firms and maintain 10,000 Canadian jobs over the next 3 months. Funding will begin to be delivered within a matter of days. When we support early stage firms, we're not only protecting the next generation of Canadian entrepreneurs, but also the people they employ. And we make sure Canada's best technology and research stays in Canada. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Nav. And we're now ready to take your questions.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. So as usual, we'll start with 3 questions on the phone and turn to the room. 1 question, 1 follow-up, une question, un suivi. Opérateur.
Thank you. Merci. Our first question, notre première question is from Micheline Laflamme avec Radio-Canada. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour. Monsieur Thibault, pardonnez-moi. Monsieur Guilbeault, pouvez-vous nous donner un peu plus de détails sur l'aide que vous allez apporter
on the assistance you're going to be providing to the cultural and sports industries? Who will the money go to? How will it assist? Will it go to the sports associations, to the athletes more specifically?
Merci, Madame Laflamme.
Answer. Thank you, Madame Laflamme.
Ira donc à des organisations.
The funding will go to the organizations.
Notre secteur est un peu particulier.
Our sector
il est composé dans bien des cas
is different in
d'organisations.
that
70% d'entrepreneurs ou de personnes qui travaillent à leur propre compte et donc qui ne sont pas des employés pour lesquels la subvention salariale, par exemple, aurait pu s'appliquer. Alors, on parle d'organisations à but non lucratif, les organisations sportives nationales, les centres de sport, les organisations médiatiques, les éditeurs, compagnies télévisuelles, organisations dans le domaine de la musique.
TV companies.
Donc, c'est toutes ces organisations pour qui les programmes que nous avons déjà annoncés n'étaient pas bien adaptés compte tenu de la particularité du secteur des arts, de la culture et du sport.
Arts and culture and sporting sectors.
Micheline, en suivi.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Et Madame Joly, pouvez-vous me dire un peu comment ça va
Minister
fonctionner?
Joly, can you tell
Parce
us
que là, vous voulez aider
a little bit more
des
about the announcement you've made?
municipalités, là, des
talked about
entreprises qui sont dans
municipalities
les différents villages et villes à travers le pays.
in various
c'est parce que c'est
towns and villages across the country. There are companies there. Are those companies not eligible for the programs that you've announced? And what type of assistance will you be offering? Answer. What we've offered through government measures recently are a safety net. And what we're doing now is ensuring that no one is falling through the cracks. So we're tightening it up. We know, for example, that the $40,000 loan and the wage subsidy have impacts for many companies. There are some that still don't have access to that funding. So the regional development agencies will be providing assistance. The development agency in Quebec, for example, it's called DEC. And these agencies provide assistance in smaller communities in Quebec, for example, and across the country. So they're on the ground. They will be helping to provide assistance to small local businesses in those areas. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question is from Teresa Wright with the Canadian Press. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Good morning. Dr. Tam, I'm wondering if you can tell us if there's any guidance for health workers and doctors on how aid like ventilators should be rationed if it comes to that, and if anybody is working on any such guidelines.
Yeah, so there's allocation of supplies. That's a different framework, and that is in collaboration with provinces and territories in terms of the supplies of ventilators that we have. Now, on the ground, physicians and other health workers have to make some very difficult decisions sometimes if there was not enough ventilators or ICU beds. So those guidance are have been put in place at the provincial and territorial level, and certainly that flows down to the hospital level, so that you have these, and they're drafted by a broad range of experts, including ethicists and clinical and ICU and other experts and health systems experts, so that those difficult decisions can be facilitated at the time that they're needed.
Follow-up?
Yes, and my follow-up question is for Minister Morneau. Many people on social assistance programs are surviving on less than people who are getting the CERB, and many marginalized Canadians just can't access it. So rather than continue to tweak it as you have been doing, why not just make the CERB universal?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's important to acknowledge that there are certainly people who are experiencing real challenges. We understand that. What we've been trying to do through the course of this crisis period is to address the people who've lost their income, who've lost their ability to continue to lead the life they were leading it before the crisis as a result of COVID-19. So that's how we've directed our attention. The good news is it's impacting, the measures we put forward are really having a big impact. We've, as you know, seen literally millions, more than 5 million people come onto the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. We, as of yesterday, had more than 220,000 small firms that applied for the Canada Emergency Business Account. So the measures we're taking are having a very, very wide application. And as you see today, we are trying to make sure that for places where, in particular for businesses that employ people where they need additional support, we're coming forward to make sure that we provide that support.
Thank you, Minister. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, is from Émilie Bergeron avec Agence QMI. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour. Je ne sais pas trop à qui adresser ma question. La personne qui aura une réponse. En fait, c'est au sujet des militaires qui qui sont envoyés au Québec.
Soldiers being sent
Dans
in to
un
help out in
article
Quebec.
du Maclean's,
In a
il y a
Maclean's article,
une médecin qui a œuvré dans les forces armées canadiennes qui parle de 2500 personnes qui ont de la formation médicale qui pourraient être disponibles, mais qui a un problème au niveau de la reconnaissance de leurs qualifications au Québec et en Ontario. Est-ce qu'il n'y aurait pas un moyen de faire une exception pour que plus de personnes que les 125 militaires soient déployés et qu'on ait
these
plus de
particular
personnel à
soldiers
envoyer?
can be
Merci
used to
pour la
provide
question.
assistance.
C'est
Minister
Christian
Freeland,
qui
answer.
répond. La décision de répondre aux demandes du Québec,
The decision to respond to
qui était
Quebec's
annoncée pour le
request
Premier ministre ce matin, est une importante décision.
that went to the Prime Minister is an important one.
C'était une décision qui a été prise
It's a
en
decision
étroite collaboration
that was made
entre
in
le Québec,
close cooperation
les forces
with
armées
Quebec,
canadiennes,
the Canadian
le
Forces,
ministre d'urgence et le
Minister of
ministre de
Public
la Santé.
Safety, the Minister of Health,
On a travaillé très très fort
the Minister of
pour
Defense.
trouver les gens
We worked
appropriés,
hard to identify
les gens, avec les
the
langues
necessary people
nécessaires, avec la formation
with the
nécessaire pour aider
language skills,
le
the training
Québec.
required
Et
to
comme
help
vous
in
savez,
Quebec.
on a trouvé 125 personnes.
We identified
et
125
c'était,
people.
Décidé en collaboration
And a
avec
decision
le Québec.
was made
Ces gens feront une grande différence.
in conjunction with
Concernant
Quebec, and these people will
l'avenir,
make
concernant la
a
question
difference.
si les autres
With
gens
respect
seront nécessaires,
to providing additional assistance,
discute toujours chaque
we
heure avec le
continue
Québec.
to
On
hold
travaille
ongoing discussions
avec les
with
provinces
Quebec.
pour les
We are working with
appuyer.
Quebec
Et je veux aussi
to support
ajouter,
the
comme a dit
province.
le Premier
I'd also
ministre,
like
qu'il
to
y a
add
aussi du travail
that
avec la Croix-Rouge canadienne,
the Prime
qui
Minister
va
has stated we
aussi
will be
aider le
working with
Québec.
the Red Cross that
Et
will
il y a
also help
aussi
in
les
Quebec.
bénévoles qui sont enregistrés
Then
par la
there
santé
are the
canadienne.
volunteers
Et on travaille
who
aussi
have
avec cette
registered.
liste de personnes
So
pour
we'll
trouver
also be working
encore des
with
personnes
that list of
qui
people
peuvent
to
travailler.
identify those who
Merci.
can help. Thank you.
Émilie en suivi.
A follow-up question?
Émilie.
Et des bénévoles.
And what about
qui
the
se sont inscrits.
volunteers?
Est-ce que vous pouvez nous donner une idée de combien de
Can you give us
personnes
an idea
de plus pourraient être
How
envoyées
many
au
more
Québec
people could be
de la
sent to
Croix-Rouge
Quebec
et
from the Red Cross then?
issus des bénévoles?
And from that list of volunteers?
Pas
Answer,
jusqu'à ce
Minister Freeland.
moment.
At this
Je veux
point, no.
souligner
What I do
que,
want to underscore
c'est absolument essentiel
is
pour
that
nous de
it
travailler
is
en
essential
étroite collaboration
to work in close
avec
cooperation
le Québec.
with the
On
province.
fait ce travail ensemble.
We are doing this work
mais
together.
je veux aussi assurer le Québec,
And
les
I'd also
Québécois et les
like to
Québécoises que
assure
nous
Quebecers
comprenons
that
l'urgence
we
de la
fully
situation,
understand
nous
the
comprenons vraiment
urgency of
la
the situation.
tragédie de la situation et nous travaillons
And
très très fort
we are
pour
working
trouver
very
les
hard
ressources pour aider
to find
les
the
Québécois et les
resources
Québécoises.
to help Quebecers.
Merci, Madame la Vice-Première
Thank
Ministre.
you,
On va
Minister.
turn to the room, starting with David Thornton, CBC.
The woes in the oil and gas sector isn't going away anytime soon. So some people are probably wondering, is there going to be any more help that's going to be on the way? And can you maybe walk us through the range of things that you're thinking of, Minister Morneau, Minister Regan?
I'm going to, just because with all the three people on screens, it requires a little bit of traffic cop activity. So I'm going to turn to Seamus first. Is that okay, David?
That's fine.
Okay, Seamus, please. Seamus, you need to turn your mic back on.
A lot of what Bill has already put into place has had a very positive effect with the CERB and with the wage subsidy particularly. I mean, what we're announcing today are very particular initiatives. Firstly, what I've heard from all sides, whether it be labor or whether it be industry, everybody's talked about liquidity. I remember my first meeting after the lockdown with the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers saying their top 5 priorities were liquidity, liquidity, liquidity. So that we understood to be a priority. We heard the same from workers. So this is really important for small to medium-sized businesses. I think there's a perception that the industry is dominated by massive capital projects, big oil rigs, miles of pipeline, and in fact, it's dominated by small to medium-sized businesses, and that's roughly where about 85% of the workforce is. So concentrating on them right now is a very good thing. I'll bring the rest over to Bill.
Okay, Bill.
Really, I think Seamus gave a good understanding of what the key issue is for the energy sector. I think what I could say is writ large across the country, what we're seeing is that there are businesses across the country who need access to credit during a challenging time. And what we're announcing today is that the energy sector is particularly challenged, and that's why that's so important. The other initiatives that we put in place today, the ability to remediate orphan wells and abandoned wells, to reduce our methane emissions, these are going to get people working. It's about jobs in places where we don't have access to jobs. So I think that this is critically important for people in those places where they're seeing extreme challenges. And we need to recognize that we will have other measures talking about how we provide credit across medium-sized businesses and larger businesses. And there's more for us to talk about in that regard in coming days.
Okay, thank you. And this question is from one of my colleagues. She's asking, we know that contact tracing is important in the fight against the spread of COVID-19. Minister Baines, what discussions are you having at the federal level about using technology to facilitate that? And are there any conversations about using cell phone data?
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for that question. As we've indicated, all options are on the table. We're going to deploy all the tools that we need to make sure we protect Canadians' health and well-being. Right now, we're focused on economic measures. We are evaluating different solutions with respects to providing more information to Canadians on better practices to follow social distancing, physical distancing, making sure that they take those appropriate steps to keep themselves safe. With respects to contact tracing, we're looking at other jurisdictions. We want to make sure that if we are moving forward in that area, that we also deal with issues with respects to privacy in a meaningful way. Still early stages, and we've engaged with a robust group of people across the country that are working on some early stage technology projects, but we haven't made any final determination in terms of what we want to support or move forward with. But we have incredible innovative companies across the country that are stepping up, that are thinking through these challenges, and we are engaged with them.
Thank you, Minister Baines. Mike.
Good morning, Dr. Tim. How would you characterize the COVID picture across the country, and what accounts for the big regional differences, say, between Quebec and the prairies and the Maritimes and stuff?
I think the majority of cases, as I said, are in the four biggest jurisdictions, perhaps not surprisingly. And there's different variations in terms of the actual epidemiology. However, I would have to say that the long-term care homes or senior residents outbreak is in quite a number of them, and that's what's driving some of the unfortunate increase in deaths. So the bigger jurisdictions, and particularly right now in Ontario and Quebec. But I think the March break, as I said, might have had some resulted in the difference in timing of some of the epidemic trajectories. Some jurisdictions have implemented measures and that hasn't actually got community transmission. So that some of the smaller jurisdictions and the territories, they've managed to pick up all the imported cases, prevented onward transmission, and did the contact tracing. So they're actually quite different.
And this is for, well, I'll ask it and see who wants to answer. Does this suggest that there's a different approaches we could take to restarting the country depending on what province we're dealing with?
Thanks for the question, Mike. And let me just say that that the question of the economic impact of the lockdown was absolutely discussed at the First Minister's call with the Prime Minister last night. And all of the premiers shared the very diverse experience across the country and spoke both about the diverse approaches people are taking to fighting the coronavirus. And the call is very useful that way because people can share best practice. And they spoke about the different places that they are in flattening the curve and about how that was shaping their own views about next steps to take. What I will say is that we as a country, of course, need to understand that we are a huge, huge country, and therefore, understandably, very, very diverse. And as Dr. Tam has just said, one thing we have in common, though, is every single Canadian has made a huge sacrifice already in fighting the coronavirus. That sacrifice is starting to pay off. As we heard from Dr. Tam earlier this week, overall in the whole country, it is now possible to be, I think as Dr. Tam put it, ever so slightly, cautiously optimistic that we are achieving some kind of flattening. What is so essential for us all is not to squander that achievement. We have all paid too high a price already to throw it away. And so what I can say on behalf of the federal government is we believe really strongly that we need to be really, really careful, really deliberate, and really thoughtful about next steps. Above all, let's remember that we've paid a really high price already, and let's be sure that the sacrifices we have made are not wasted.
Kevin? Afternoon. This question is directed to Deputy Prime Minister Freeland and Dr. Tam. With concerns about the lack of transparency from China at the start of this outbreak, the COVID-19 death toll in Wuhan has been increased by 50% in a recent revision from Chinese authorities. How has the inaccuracy of the data and the suppression of information about the outbreak in China affected Canada's response to this crisis?
Let Dr. Tam start, but then I'm happy to offer a response as well.
Yeah, I think I've just been made aware of the numbers, and I think, I'm really keen to learn further about what that means. It's such a rapidly evolving situation, but I think it is important globally to understand the full spectrum of the illness. So I think getting further clarification is important. Of course, we actually have to have that understanding from every country as much as possible so that it actually helps us with some of our actions going forwards.
Yeah, and I would just add to that first and foremost, the very difficult decisions that we have had to take as a country in response to this global pandemic are based first and foremost on Canadian data and on the Canadian reality. And those are decisions taken by Canadian political leaders, informed by the best expert advice we can get. Our job, our primary job, is fighting it here at home, and we make our battle plans based what is happening on the ground here in Canada. Of course, the actions that we take in Canada are informed by what we are seeing around the world, and we consult, including at a political level, widely with colleagues and partners around the world. Our Minister of Health participates in a G7 health ministers call, which is weekly. I have spoken to the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, who happens to be a friend, and I think the Singaporean experience is very valuable for us. And then just the final thing I would add is, because this pandemic poses such a threat to our country, it is absolutely appropriate for our response to be informed by the best intelligence we can get, and our response is informed by Canada's excellent intelligence experts who are a very important part of the work the government is doing and have been briefing the government and ministers. And they, of course, work first and foremost with our closest security partners, the Five Eyes, NATO, and NORAD. And so the advice they give us is informed by the information shared and collected together by that community.
As a follow-up, just how is it best to move forward with all these things being what you just said, right? Of course, the data now you're looking at from other countries, including China, that relationship that you have with other countries when you're trying to combat a global pandemic. Are there any concerns that Chinese cooperation and lack of transparency or accuracy of information coming out of China could in any ways affect Canadian researchers that are cooperating with the lab in Wuhan, for example? Is there any concern about that in terms of combating the spread of this pandemic and devising ways to stop it?
Well, I think global collaboration on scientific discovery and research is really important, and it can be in any area like diagnostics, vaccines, treatments. So I do think that as much global collaboration as possible is important. And in terms of our research, I know that our colleagues at the Canadian Institute of Health Research, really the way that our government's projects are funded is really based on peer review and a scientific process that's independent. So I think we have to rely on the scientific process itself as to whether projects are worthy of funding. And I think and many projects actually involve many countries. So there's quite a number of projects funded in Canada that involves not just China, but a multi-country approach. So I do think that if we're going to get to solutions fast, you still need that kind of construct. But the bottom line is that they are peer-reviewed, scientifically validated before funding is provided.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll now turn back to the phone. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, is from Marie Vastel avec Le Devoir. Please go ahead. Your line is now open.
Oui, bonjour. J'ai une question pour Monsieur Regan et Monsieur
Yes, good morning.
Morneau.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Regan and Mr. Morneau.
Mr. Regan, I was wondering about what further help could come for the oil and industry. Many were asking and maybe even expecting that the government do more, for example, by taking equity shares into oil companies, as the government did in 2008 with automobile companies. I'm wondering if the government is considering that, and if not, why not? And Minister Morneau, I don't know if this was related to that, but you sort of alluded to credit for medium businesses, so I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you were suggesting.
Seamus, do you want to start? And remember to unmute yourself.
It's open. I've learned my lesson twice over. Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. I would just say that today was really, the focus today was on workers. I think that if you look at our initiatives in any sector or any benefit, we have changed over time. I mean, Bill has been making tweaks and changes to almost everything that we've introduced. So nothing really quite looks the same because we're listening to Canadians, we're listening to stakeholders, and we're making changes where needed. Today was really focused on workers in two fashions. First of all, liquidity, to make sure that the companies that hire those workers remain intact so they can keep those workers. And secondly, with orphan and inactive wells, this is technical work, highly skilled work that we think can.
I don't think you've muted yourself, but the technology is muting you, Seamus. Let's pause for a moment. Okay, I'm sorry, Seamus, we can't hear you here. Okay, maybe try again.
Okay.
You said highly skilled workers. That was the last phrase we heard.
Yeah, and speaking about orphan and inactive wells, yes. I mean, these are highly skilled workers that, we think that, it could employ upwards of 5,000 people. We'll be able to get them working right away because they're already deemed to be essential workers. So, and it has the added benefit, obviously, and an environmental benefit in cleaning up these wells. So it's in keeping with our environmental priorities and our commitment to net zero.
Okay, thank you. And maybe now, Bill, would you like to answer the part of the question directed at you? And could we move there we go. We see you now.
The key thing that we've heard from businesses across the country really is that they need access to credit. We've got a particular challenge where businesses are either not operating or operating with significantly less revenue for a period of time, and they need credit to get through that time. So that's why what we've come forward with today is so appropriate for businesses. Businesses don't want government taking equity in their business. They want to find a way that they can continue in their business operations so they can continue to have the opportunities both for their people and for their organization that they're seeking. We've been working together, as Seamus said, with organizations in the sector, also speaking to people within the various provincial governments. And we think this is targeted appropriately. It's credit, it's on a commercial basis, and it will allow businesses, and businesses importantly in the energy sector that are critically important to jobs in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland and Labrador, to bridge this time to get to what we know will be a better time once we get through this crisis.
Marion suivi?
Well, it sort of sounds like you weren't quite in agreement in your answer, so I guess I'll ask it again. In terms of the possibility of government buying equity shares in oil companies, it sort of sounds, Minister O'Regan, like you were saying maybe. Am I correct in understanding that in what you were saying?
No, what I am saying is that we continue to listen to stakeholders, to listen to their suggestions, to listen directly to them. I think myself and my colleagues spent most of our days doing that. We've listened very carefully. Some things we're able to do today. I know in the case, for instance, with Newfoundland and Labrador, there are further initiatives that we're looking at to keep the industry competitive, and we'll be working with them on that. And I think I'd also like to take the opportunity to speak to just how constructive our relationship has been with the provinces. I enjoy very good relationships with energy ministers and natural resource ministers right across the country, and Canadians should know how constructive they've been, particularly the three energy ministers from the three oil and gas producing provinces, Newfoundland, Labrador, Saskatchewan, and of course Alberta. They have been very, very constructive, and a lot of what we've been able to do, we have been able to do together.
Thank you, Ministers. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, is from Heather Schofield with the Toronto Star. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Yes, this is a question for Ministers Morneau and O'Regan. I would like to clarify, if I could, about what exactly the enhanced liquidity is. I've only heard some vague references to expanding the capacity of EDC and BDC, but what is it sector specific? It's on a commercial basis, but on what basis exactly? And is that the end of your help for distressed sectors at this point?
Heather started with Bill, so why don't we start with Bill too? Bill, please.
Well, thanks, Heather. So first of all, the broad picture, we recognize that there are businesses across the country that need access to credit. So that is critically important. The emergency business account is for the smallest of businesses. The credit we've already put out over the course of the last few weeks through the Business Development Bank and Export Development Canada is up to $12.5 million of credit for small to mid-sized businesses. What we're really talking today is about credit for those mid-sized businesses. And we start with the energy sector, where we know that, as Seamus mentioned, the challenges are very significant. It's COVID-19, it's the challenge in the changing oil prices, and it's the decrease in demand. So these things together means that credit is very much needed for those businesses. That's why we've started there. There will be more that we need to do for credit across mid-sized businesses across the country, and that will be coming shortly.
Seamus, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just to reinforce the point that the vast majority of workers in the oil and gas sector are in small and medium-sized businesses, whether it's contractors or drillers or producers, smaller operators, people who produce drill bits and safety gloves right across the country. So, a focus on them is a focus on workers and ensuring that these companies remain intact so that these workers have jobs to come back to once we get through this.
Okay, so as a follow-up, could you put a number on the expansion of the liquidity enhancements that you've done today, and also, is there a point at which you would tie lending or liquidity or help for the oil and gas sector to companies vowing to move to net zero?
Bill, why don't you start? I think Bill maybe has started. Yeah.
There's really those are two, I guess, separate questions. First of all, with respect to the scale of the support, it's going to be demand driven. So we know that for firms in the energy sector, they're going to need access to this credit. We're not putting a limitation. It's on a commercial basis, but it's going to allow them to get through this challenge. And with respect to firms' ability to get to a more a reduction in their carbon footprint, you're seeing us do specific things today that are going to have an important impact. The idea that we're allowing for firms to have access to repayable loans so that they can reduce their methane emissions is critically important. It's going to allow firms in Alberta and Saskatchewan and the offshore sector in Newfoundland and Labrador to reduce their emissions. And we're working together to make sure that that happens. So we're doing both those things today, providing a bridge to the future for important firms that employ, literally hundreds of thousands of Canadians, and also dealing with our environmental footprint for the long term.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Seamus?
I would just add that in February, I gave a speech at Globe, the biggest clean tech conference. It was held in Vancouver. It's the biggest in North America, and said there, quite firmly that there was no way we're going to get to net zero without our oil-producing provinces and without the oil and gas sector. And the next day, with Energy Minister Sonia Savage in Calgary, we hosted an innovation summit where I said, the oil and gas industry has to look seriously at net zero. Investors have changed. The investment climate has changed. People like Mark Carney, firms like BlackRock have been signaling this, and the market has moved. So, we need to look at investments in net zero, investments that get us there, because that will make the industry, our industries, more competitive. And particularly, we're looking at methane. Methane is less of an issue in Newfoundland and Labrador, so we're going to open that up to, what technologies and what things exist that will help Newfoundland and Labrador be more competitive against common jurisdictions like Norway and the United Kingdom, who have also committed to net zero.
Thank you, Ministers. Operator, one last question.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question is from Kelsey Johnson with Reuters. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Thank you for taking my question. My questions are for Minister Morneau. Minister Morneau, you have promised now for several weeks additional support for other hard-hit sectors like aviation and tourism. I'm just wondering how much longer you think those companies will be able to hang on. Do you have an updated timeline as to when we'll see those aid packages?
Thank you. What's really critical for us is that we get to having the biggest impact as we possibly can have on those people that are impacted by this crisis, and also find a bridge for companies. So you've seen us deal with people first. So we've been supporting through the emergency response benefit and through the wage subsidy people. But you'll also note that has had a very important impact on organizations in all sectors. So, for example, in the airline sector, you saw Air Canada bring back its employees because we put the wage subsidy in place. That gives them a bridge to the future. We do know that there needs to be more done in terms of credit in sectors across the country. Our approach is to be making sure that we have something that's for the smallest of firms, the smaller firms that might be a little larger. What we've talked about today is middle-sized firms, mid-tier firms in the energy sector. We're going to go broader on mid-sized firms in the coming days, and then we will need to provide provide credit for the largest of firms to make sure they can bridge the gap as well. That work is underway, and it will be in the coming short while that we'll have more to say. In the interim, we are working with firms that are coming to us to make sure that they understand that we're going to provide the appropriate level of credit support to get them through this.
Thank you for that. And I guess as a follow-up, I'm wondering for the other sectors like aviation and tourism, the credit that you are looking at providing, is that going to be similar in terms of how it's delivered as you've announced today for the energy firm?
Well, I think you'll see similar approaches in everything we're doing. We're trying to make sure that credit that gets delivered can be delivered through the financial institutions that organizations large and small already have relationships with. You're seeing the government finding a way to ensure that the banks get that credit support out. And we're recognizing that we have an important role through Business Development Canada and Export Development Corporation to be part of that backstop. So we'll continue to do that. We do know that the only way we can get people through this is by supporting their employees, first and foremost, supporting individuals, and making sure firms can get up and running afterwards. That means credit support to provide working capital for them during this time. And as I mentioned, there's other things that we're looking at. We're also looking at how we can work together with the provinces on issues like rent for small and medium-sized firms that have been particularly impacted. So there are more things we're working on. We're going to continue to ensure that we have a robust economy when we get through this challenge.
Thank you, Minister. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.